Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic, let's do it. What's one of those trust your gut feelings that you had that you're actually glad you did? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I was once walking down a street at night and randomly thought to myself, yikes, I'm going to get mugged. I ignored the feeling, got mugged. When I was a teen, I'd make a few bucks helping local farmers bale hay. The hay would be stacked on a trailer and towed by a tractor to the barn. I usually sat on the front of the trailer on the way to the barn, but I suddenly felt like that wasn't a good place to be, so I moved to the back. As soon as I did, I heard a chang. The hitch had come loose from the tractor while heading down a steep hill. I climbed down the back and easily stepped off, moments before the trailer flipped over into a ravine. In high school, my best friend and I were hanging out and drinking with this group of a few guys that we had known for a while. When it was time for us to go home for curfew, they told us they would walk with us. The fastest way across a creek bed and down under an overpass, and we had gone that way a million times before. I had a really bad feeling about walking that way that night. I had brand new white shoes on, so I used that as my reason for wanting to walk the long way on public streets. My friend was annoyed, and the guys got mad and told us to walk by ourselves. A few months later, 3 of those guys were arrested for R-ing a girl when she got drunk with them. I don't know if anything really would have happened that night, but I do remember being really scared for no apparent reason. Not me, my grandfather. He used to never wear his seatbelt. One day he's driving around with my mom and suddenly remarks, "I feel like I'm about to go through the windshield," and buckles in. Less than 30 seconds later, as they're going through an intersection, a car blows the red light going like 40 miles per hour and slams into my grandpa's side of the car. He walked away with nothing worse than some fractured ribs, and now he always wears a seatbelt. I'm not sure if it qualifies, but I used to live and work in the suburbs. One evening I was driving home at dusk. I was 18 to 19 and had the house to myself. Brother was out of town, and Mom was with her parents. My job was about 10 miles from my house and maybe 6 turns on decent-sized roads. I'm a fairly observant person, and it wouldn't be odd for the same car to be behind me for half of those turns. But this time a car followed me all the way to my residential street. I got a gut feeling I was being followed, so I passed my house and turned left. My house was one over from the corner of another residential street that was a quarter-mile loop that also had another small street in it that reconnected to the loop, then back to my street. This car followed me as I made a loop. I then turned right to restart the loop, and it followed me again. This time I turned down the small street and completed the loop again. It followed me one more time. As I was about to make the loop for the 4th time, they finally drove off. I drove around another 5 minutes just to make sure they didn't circle back, as I had nowhere else to park except out front of my house. But I was creeped out the rest of the night. I slept with my door locked and barricaded, and with a big kitchen knife. I have no idea if or why they followed me. I don't know if it was a friend pranking me or if my brother put one of his friends up to it, since it's the only time that's ever happened, and it was quite coincidental that I was alone. I worked in retail, and some of the employees did have records, so I just don't know. I noticed pain in my lower back one morning and thought I slept on it wrong or something. Throughout the day it continued and started to feel like it when you get kicked in the groin. I thought to myself, it's probably cancer. I did a self-check and didn't think I noticed anything. I had my girlfriend do the same and she wasn't sure. I called a urology office on my gut feeling and got the last appointment before Christmas break. It was cancer, but it was super early. I got an orchiectomy a few days later, then some mild chemo a few months later, and have been just fine ever since. I had to leave for an appointment, and for some reason I felt the urge to just sit in my car before leaving. I've sat there just looking around for 2 minutes or so, then the feeling went away and I left. When I was on the highway, I saw a crash happen just minutes before I was supposed to be there. A truck blew a tire and hit other cars, which hit other cars as well. It was a mess. 2 people died, A few others were heavily injured and sent to the hospital. I was in traffic behind the scene for about 2 hours and was so glad I just sat in my car, staring around, before leaving. I still do that sometimes, thinking back to that moment. When I was pregnant, I got hit by a Lyme tick at 28 weeks. I noticed the bullseye and got on antibiotics. My OBGYN brushed it off after that. No harm was done according to her. When I went to the hospital at 35 weeks to register for delivery, a normal procedure here, I mentioned the Lyme, but that I took ABX. The next day they call me and tell me they want to induce at 37 weeks because Lyme can damage the placenta, and they would rather not risk it. Oof. I talked to my OBGYN about it, and she basically laughed it off, telling me not to induce. My gut instinct told me to induce, so I went with the hospital's advice and had my son at 37 weeks. He was tiny, and it took a tough few weeks to get him to eat and stuff because he was so tiny and tired. The hospital sent the placenta to pathology. It was severely damaged, and it wouldn't have held up much longer. If I'd listened to my OBGYN, I would have probably lost my son. Needless to say, I switched OBGYNs after that. Yes, mom instinct is extremely strong, and I'm a firm believer in it myself, so good for you, Mom. This is not mine, but it is chilling. About 15 years ago, I worked with a guy who told me that in his younger days, aged 12 if I recall correctly, he attended a local youth club. One night, the guy that ran it wanted the boys to go shirts versus skins for a game of football, or whatever. My workmate was to be on the skins team. He refused to take his shirt off. One thing led to another, a big drama ensued. He got kicked out of the club and sent home. His mom and dad weren't happy. They started giving him a row, asking why he'd make such a fuss. He said he wasn't comfortable taking his top off in front of the youth leader, as there was just something about the guy. A few years later, the youth leader, Thomas Hamilton, brutally murdered 16 children and their teacher in Dunblane Primary School. I worked at a bar that had a very friendly gentleman offer to buy me dinner after we had some banter about my favorite beer. I was flattered, and he was handsome, but something in me didn't feel that it sat right. It turns out he was a serial killer and killed a backpacker, Grace Mullane. Give it a Google, but proceed with caution. Mere weeks later, the police interviewed me to try and find out more about what he had said. He had offered to take a few girls out before he killed Grace. Grace and I were the same age, height, and build. I still have nightmares and survivor guilt. He also arred some ladies. Trust your effing gut. Someone I came into contact with at work semi-frequently, once every 1 to 2 months, gave me the creeps, but for no apparent reason. He never said anything inappropriate or touched me, and I could never figure out why. A couple years later, it came to light that he was drugging young patients and videotaping and R-ing them in his clinic, a family medicine doctor. His wife found the footage and turned him in. I have so many situations like this, but this one definitely stands out. I live by the mantra that if it feels weird, it is weird. Our gut instincts are usually spot on. In the days of MySpace, a girl I knew through high school extracurriculars posted a vague warning about an active duty sailor she met online who seemed normal, but suddenly wouldn't take no for an answer. I messaged her to ask if she was okay, and she told me his name, warning me not to engage with him if he tries to contact me. She then mentioned how she had been deleting some of her pictures and profile details because she honestly thought he might try to show up where she worked or even at our shared after-school activity. Literally, the following week, I had shown up for extracurricular and was in the process of setting up with a few other people. The girl was in the women's restroom down a long, dark, isolated hall far removed from the primary entryway. Out of nowhere, a guy who looked high schoolish in face and build and could fit in with us only in that sense, but who I had never seen before, showed up and began looking around as if he knew the place and knew what he was after. I was used to other kids around my age dropping by to visit out of curiosity, but they would normally just stand around awkwardly until approached. This guy's level of focus struck me as extremely disconcerting, and I couldn't shake this feeling that I needed to tell the girl first, and any nearby adult. Because I felt so weirded out, I already knew I didn't want to talk to him, so I looked at the sign-in sheet at the entryway. He was the creeper the girl told me about. As soon as I knew that he couldn't take notice of where I was headed, I booked it down the hall toward the women's restroom, where I found the girl and told her what I saw and how I knew it was him. She started crying uncontrollably, and I told her to lock the door and that I was going to tell the adults in charge as soon as I could find them. I then found 2 of the adults and told them what I saw and knew of the situation. The fact that the guy in question was literally just in the other room from us, and that the girl had already locked herself in the bathroom. I was only 15. I don't know how I stayed so calm. The adults kicked right into action, escorting the guy off the premises and filing a police report. So it wasn't my gut, but my friend's. I had noticed that whenever she had a bad feeling, it almost always turned out to be correct. We were going to sneak out one night and ride in the back of a friend's truck like we did sometimes. She told me she had a bad feeling, and I immediately backed out, as did she. The others didn't listen, and that night the truck flipped with 2 of our friends in the back. They were both hospitalized for a couple of weeks. One shattered his arm so badly that it never fully healed, and the other has full back scars from road burn. Not my feeling, but my mom's a few weeks ago. She works near me and also lives near me. She was going home at lunch to meet a plumber and offered to drive me to my house so I could let my dog out. I normally take the bus to work and then the bus home at lunch and back, so the plan was for her to drive me home so I could walk my dog for a bit longer, and then I'd take the bus back. But when we got to my house, she said she thought she better just drive me back to work real quick. It's like 10 minutes, and then go meet the plumber. On our way back, we saw ambulances and police cars going back toward my house. I pulled up a police scanner, and we realized there was a shooting at my bus stop at the time I would have been waiting for the bus back to work. This is my dad's story. My grandfather was old but in good health. Every night, my dad used to call my grandfather, tell him he's coming over, then go and spend an hour talking to him. One night, he had this feeling he had to go, just had to go. He called and said he was coming. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then a series of really unlikely things happened. The Walmart register transaction had some technical issues that took 15 minutes to sort out. Then there was an accident, causing more traffic backups, which added another delay. Then there was a third thing that I no longer remember. When my dad finally got to my grandfather's, my grandfather had died, as if he had simply fallen over in his bedroom mid-step. My dad, a physician actually, wonders to this day, what if he had shown up just 30 to 45 minutes earlier? At school there was an event with a little buffet line. I was in line next to one of my classmates whom I didn't know well. Nothing happened. I might have said a word or two to him. I went to sit down next to my now husband. We hadn't been dating for long. He whispered that I should never be alone with that classmate who was next to me in line. I pushed him for more. Did he know him? He said no, he had never seen him before, but he could tell he was a bad dude. I couldn't really explain it. Later that year, we learned he AR'd at least 7 classmates. The husband said he'd only gotten that feeling a few times, but it always pans out. He can just read criminal sociopaths or something. We listen to that gut feeling when it happens. I shouted at my daft brother-in-law to get out of the sea. He's a fit, strong, and confident swimmer, but he had his young daughter on his shoulders, and my gut was telling me that the waves were just too rough to be safe. They were both fine, but after we all returned home, we heard that another strong, confident swimmer died in exactly the same place about half an hour later. I thought my son's breathing was weird. He was 4 days old. I couldn't even explain to his doctor what I thought was weird. I just knew it was weird. I took him into the pediatrician, and she did a basic look at him, watched him breathe, and said he was fine. I'm just in anxious mommy mode. Yeah, okay. The following day, I take him into the room and tell them the same thing. I don't know what it is, but his breathing is just weird, and boom. His oxygen was 72. He ended up staying on supplemental oxygen at home for 2 months. I was crying to one of the nurses, and he told me, "Mom instinct is real, and I've seen it save a lot of kids' lives." So I'm a practicing lawyer in Islamabad, Pakistan. Back in 2014, Pakistan was affected by frequent terrorist attacks due to the country's role in the fight against terror. One morning, as I came from court to a little side office in the court premises that we had and was conversing with my other colleagues, the sound of gunfire began. Some of my junior colleagues tried to go and see what was going on, and I ushered them to go and see back inside for fear that they might catch a stray bullet. I bolted the doors from inside and asked them to remain seated. Now the doors were made of glass, and the rest of the wall was also glass. The gunfire continued for what I could sense was 10 minutes, but it seemed like an eternity. We all assumed that perhaps this was a skirmish between two litigating parties, and we didn't want to be caught in the middle. The sound of gunfire increased, but we could not get a sense of the direction it was coming from. As the tension grew, I recited the kalma and prepared for a shooter to stand in front of the glass door and mow us down. Just then, a few bullets hit the rear wall of the small building we were in. This made it clear where the fire was coming from. I consulted with a colleague, sprang up to open the door, ushered everyone outside, and pointed to where I wanted them to run. Being the last one to leave, I turned around and saw the shooter, who followed us as we turned a corner to flee. Just as he was about to line up a shot at one of us, an anti-terrorism squad gunman stationed on the roof fired at the shooter and hit him in the chest. The shooter was wearing a suicide vest, and just as he realized he was done, he pulled the cord, and I saw a human body being blown to bits. Unforgettable sight. In that state of panic, and not knowing if there were other shooters, we ran until we could not see the court buildings. 14 people died that day, and dozens were injured. We visited the scene days later, and I saw a crater where the shooter had blown himself up, right next to where I stood when I held the door open and ushered my colleagues out. Had we not bolted from there, we'd be dead for sure. Glad I trusted my gut then. I was almost the first victim of a serial aurist who pretended to be a cop. The whole night was bad. It started with getting yelled at for not wanting to smoke weed around a kid. Mom thought I was being judgmental of her. I mean, she wasn't exactly wrong, but it was illegal back then, and I didn't want to smoke around their toddler. Then the husband cornered me later and tried to make out with me, and I was like, I'm going home. I'm walking home, and this guy stops and asks if I need a ride. I start backing away from his car and say, "No, I'm cool." So he pulls out a badge and says, "I'm a cop. I have a big bag of weed in my pocket." So I reiterate that I'm good. I ended up walking the long way home so I could make sure I wasn't being followed. Oddly enough, it was a friend of my mom's who got him caught. He was pulling women over and pretending to be a cop, and he R'd a bunch of people. My mom's friend worked with the cops and knew who they were. So when he tried to pull her over, she knew something was wrong. I didn't realize who I had been dealing with until the news article came out about him. I'm glad I have a rule to back away from people's cars, so I'm never in arm's reach. I always stay far enough away from cars that if someone can open the car and lean out, they still can't reach me. I wanted to talk to a professor about an essay I was writing. I knew her office hours were open. She just talked to a bunch of friends, and she had good grades. It was a new term and things were good. Even nice weather for the fall term. I thought, F it, I'll just grab a snack from the student store. I walk in, pop open a cup of noodles, not a sponsor, and dispensed hot water into it. As I was paying for it at the counter, a student burst in out of breath, crying and frantic. She said to call the police, as there was an active shooter. We hid in the supply closet next to snacks and textbooks, along with at least 6 others. The student explained where it was, and it was a rampage through the same building I was about to go to. My professor was with the student, and I would have been waiting right in the open near where part of the rampage took place. At least 9 people died that day, and one was someone I grew up with. If it weren't for my gut literally feeling empty and my mind saying, F it, I would have had a front row seat to that. Not sure if this constitutes the scariest, but there was a guy I used to go to a community college with back in 2014 to 2016. Called him Mark. Mark was older than me by several years, and if memory serves, he was studying political science. We had mutual friends, and I'd see him at parties or at hangouts. I can't say he always gave me the creeps, but I definitely noticed there was something about him that was off. Ironically enough, he could be surprisingly charismatic and didn't have a difficult time with women, despite not being the most handsome guy in the world. What really got me, though, was one time at a hangout, Mark and I got to talking. I said something to him that made him stop and stare me down. I stared back because I thought it was in jest, and then I noticed there wasn't anything in his eyes, like staring into black holes, and tripped me out. Remarkably intelligent guy, too, and I'm almost ashamed to say that we ended up getting along for some time after that, because I was never able to shake the off feeling he gave me, but I could only ever tolerate him in doses, so I kept him at a distance until I found out who he really was. Apparently, years before we ended up at community college together, he'd either been in some kind of frat or communal living where he threw this party and ended up marrying a woman. I found this out through a close friend who knew him then, but who was beaten unconscious by the other people in the house before he could stop it from happening. He told me that Mark had apparently done psychedelics out in the desert with some friends prior to that incident, and when he got back, he was just different. Obviously, I ensured there was no contact between us anymore. Well, through mutual friends, I found out that a few years ago he murdered his mom. Dude had a psychotic break, killed her, and dumped her body in his town's lake. It made the local news. Dude's still so out of it that he's been put in the state's mental institution for the rest of his life. Not me, but my daughter. We were at a mall and had just arrived at the food court. My daughter, 24, suddenly got agitated and said, "We have to leave. We have to leave now." I thought she was about to get sick and told her to head to the car, that I was going to get her sibling some lunch and we'd be right out. She looked terrified and said, "No, we have to go now." I had no idea what was wrong, but we quickly went to the car. We were still in the parking lot 10 minutes later waiting in traffic when several police cars zoomed in with sirens going. We found out later that a gang fight broke out in the food court where we'd just been. 12 people were arrested. We have absolutely no idea what she picked up on. There was no yelling or angry voices, no groups of gatherings, and no people who appeared to be anything but families getting lunch. But somehow, she knew something was about to happen.